When we speak of survival today, we no longer mean survival of family, of tribe, of race, of culture, even of civilization. We mean comprehensively saving the human race from itself.
We're cutting down the forest. We don't understand the full functioning of the forest for the globe itself.
The famous Haliburton Forest clearcut, I personally am not proud of. And if trees have to fall,
from the astronomy stuff to the bees, to the wolf enclosure, to the snowmobile trails, to the submarine, to the tree canopy. I mean, he has tried so many things.
He could have continued the practices that had been on that land for a century, which is every time there's something that you can cut, just cut, and then don't care about the implications, and don't worry if you don't get any more revenue from it for 50 years. I think he has a much better model.
He's ahead of things, and he's trying to do things that bump against the rules and bump against the bureaucracy. And that kind of person's not always popular with a bureaucrat.
1992. A private forest owner clearcuts right up against prime waterfront properties. It's a battle that kickstarts his legacy as a maverick, and it resets the value of a forest that's still standing.
the famous Haliburton Forest clearcut, a 38-acre patch of denuded wilderness, of destruction, and certainly a site that I personally am not proud of.
There used to be a tax reduction program, and it was removed in the 90s, and then it was replaced, and it was largely due to lobbying from Peter.
If trees have to fall because taxes are too high, I believe we have a severe problem.
He had the wherewithal and the land to say, you know, I'm going to clear cut this area, because if you don't give forest landowners a tax break, you're taxing them in an inordinate amount. This is what's going to happen.
We had this large forest with all these little lakes, and the provincial government assumed that the only purpose for this land would be to develop these lakes for cottage lots. The taxes were paid on imaginary lots, that every lake literally was divided up into imaginary little lots, and each of those lots got value. And if you added all these little lakes and all these little lots together, suddenly there was this astonishing large value that was really an imaginary value that we were to pay taxes on. And of course, those taxes had to be paid from the revenue coming from the forest.
The scene that we're looking at here today is hopefully the last of clearcuts that we see on private lands in Haliburton County, hopefully in Ontario, for a long time.
It drove the message home that these trees that we took out were worth a lot more to the world at large, even to neighbors, than they were in dollars and cents down there in some sawmill.
This is the story of a forest and of a man, and how they met under the unlikeliest of circumstances. And it's also the story of how this odd pairing led the man on a perilous quest to save a forest and maybe the planet. Well, he's at it. Peter Schleifenbaum was born in Freydeburg, Germany in 1961. And although his family worked in mining, Peter decided to work with trees instead, eventually earning his PhD in forestry. An intriguing choice for a man whose last name, Schleifenbaum, literally means dragging tree. Even more intriguing is the fact that in the 1960s, Peter's father had acquired a large tract of forest in Canada, now known as the Haliburton Forest and Wildlife Reserve. Although legend has it that this particular prize might have changed hands in order to pay off the previous owner's gambling debt. As it turned out, even 60,000 acres at the fire sale price of $7 an acre wasn't much of a prize.
It was a typically high-graded forest, low quality
difficult to manage and actually rather hopeless.
When the talk within the family came to a forester within the family taking over the lands in Canada, I declined, and I definitely declined, and I said I will never go to Canada to run Haliburton Forest.
And how did that change?
Well, I think part of that is Elke coming on the scene and a family being founded and discussions on where our family future lay.
I looked at Haliburton and this area a few times prior to our arrival here, and I agreed it is a nice place to bring up the children.
So eventually we went back to the family and said, okay, if that is an option, then certainly we will consider going to Canada. And the long story short is that in 1988, on the 1st of March, we arrived here, came off the boat, and started working. Our biggest challenge, and I think the task that we've set for ourselves, is to educate the public. I think if the public would understand the forest, especially the dynamics in the forest, better than they do today, there wouldn't be the resistance to some of the change.
You can't save what you don't understand.
The forest is so important to us because it generates the oxygen for us. The Earth, the planet Earth, is a bell jar. So you and I live our lives, breathe our air. We have to have oxygen and expel carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide you expel, or the carbon dioxide that you manufacture, goes to the functioning of a tree. We will not survive without forests.
Humanity's dependence on fossil fuels has flooded the atmosphere and the ocean with carbon dioxide, drastically changing the world's weather patterns and creating the global dilemma we now call climate change.
When we look at a tree and what we commonly call wood, which makes up the bulk of the tree, is really all carbon. That's the carbon that originally came out of the atmosphere and was taken up by the leaves through the photosynthetic process.
I'm always disappointed when I'm in buildings like these because this should all be wood. Unfortunately, our society is so indoctrinated that whenever we see wood, all we see is dead trees. We shouldn't see dead trees. We should see carbon that is tied up for years, for generations, for decades, instead of using fossil fuels that are surrounding us. And I agree, wood is the only sustainable resource we have on this planet. If we look at the fossil fuels, if we look at metal, if we look at stone, once it's dug out, it's being used, we can reformulate it, but really it is, for all intents and purposes, it is gone. Whereas wood, if we use it sustainably, we can have the cake and eat it too.
On a global scale, if we didn't have forests, the problems that we face with climate change would just be that much worse, and the deterioration of the global ecosystem would happen much more quickly.
We're not the first to learn this lesson.
Logging is not bad. Bad logging is bad.
Central European forestry, I think, is leading the world in terms of sustainable development and sustainable management of forests. But that didn't just come about because it was invented there. It was invented out of a crisis. In the late Middle Ages, forests of Central Europe were denuded. There was no timber left.
They had mismanaged their forests, and then they realized that the tremendous damage they had done in mismanaging the forests, and came back with the forestry as a profession and protect the land and manage it in the long term. And so they truly value and have deeply embedded in their culture the importance of forests. And that gives them a different perspective than we North Americans who come over here and we're overwhelmed by the vast richness given to us for free and have exploited that richness.
Europe had already been through all this. Canada started in the 1800s. After its own deforestation and clear-cutting crisis, and it set up governing bodies to deal with the problem. In Ontario, forests are managed by the Ministry of Natural Resources.
Most of the forests in Canada are publicly owned, so there are basically our trust, and it's the provincial governments that we are giving the responsibility to manage those forests for us and for our future generations. And right now they're not doing a very good job.
There's an implicit trust that government is the way to go, that only government can really act on our behalf and control what happens in the forest. Be careful. I'm not sure, history says that that's exactly the case.
In the past, when I first started working with M&R people for research, you had people who were out in the land, they knew where every tree was. There was enough foresters out there that knew everything about their land. Now, yes, we have great technology, and I think that's possible. I had even one engineer tell me about this virtual reality. He said, you know, we'll have LiDAR, we'll get a three-dimensional forest. And he said with great pride to me, he said, you know, and then we'll never have to go in the forest.
Politics is politics. You know, we're Ministry of Natural Resources, we manage resources on 5, 10, 20, or even longer, but we're still ruled by a political system that changes every 4 years. If the provincial government isn't going to be able to have the people to show the leadership, where can the public expect to get it from?
For Peter, it's not about years or decades. It's about centuries.
When you take over lands like Haliburton Forest was in the early 1960s, it's logged out, it's high graded. That means that there still is a forest there. But from an industrial forestry perspective, it would be better if there was no forest, because now you're dealing with all the trees that were left behind in the past that have no commercial value. So now you basically have to get rid of those before you can grow a new forest.
A forester, of all people, you would expect to have a fairly long-term perspective, given the resource that we're dealing with. Trees are long-lived, and they're, by and large, they live longer than people. So it involves trying to have a perspective that goes beyond a human lifetime.
To us, sustainability is not just environmental sustainability. That's often overlooked, that there are other sustainabilities. There's social sustainability, and especially there is economic sustainability. And Haliburton Forest is a private corporation. We have to pay our bills, we have to pay our staff, and we have to have funds to invest and to grow. So we really have to continuously balance our environmental mandate with the economic realities as they exist from day to day.
For years, you know, the environmental community felt that the market was at war with the environment, you know, capitalism and all that sort of stuff, you know, profit, bad thing. And if the market is not aligned with environmental interests, it's very true, it can do a lot of damage. But if you can get the market aligned with environmental interests so that what's being sold and what's being sought after and what people will pay for is something that's environmentally responsible, things can happen very quickly.
While he was waiting for the trees to grow, he had to figure out other ways to make money to keep this whole big idea afloat. Snowmobiling, hunting, camping. But he couldn't have planned for everything.
These wolves that we originally brought here were born and raised in captivity. We were offered the pack, and the pack actually at the time from the United States was going to be destroyed. The owner was desperately looking for a home for these wolves, and there aren't very many people in North America who will say, yeah, I'll take a pack of wolves. In the United States at that time, that was 1991, wolves were still an endangered species. And initially there was no notion of a wolf center. All we wanted to have is just a large enclosure where from time to time we would have a small observation area and we would take members of the public or visiting school groups into that tower, and they could join us when we were feeding the wolves. And that was really the initial intent. But within 2 years, the interest in these wolves was so dramatic and everybody wanted to see these wolves. We had literally people running down our door that we eventually decided to build the wolf center. Once a year, we have pups born into our pack. Obviously, that's a very exciting moment, probably the most exciting moment for the entire pack and all the staff at the Wolf Center in a year. So we, of course, are anxious to see what we've got. And we're also looking for fresh diggings. Yeah, this is it. And in this instance too, we need to administer some medication. It's really the first and only time that we will have hands-on contact with those animals. And in the process, we also do a little bit of maintenance along the fences. And now we're going to be off again, and we're going to be back next year. They dig their own dens, they have their own pups, they howl like in the wild, they communicate like in the wild. They've got 15 acres here to roam. They've got a little pond to drink and swim. They've got a forest environment where they can spread out a little bit. And actually this facility was awarded by the North American Zoological Society an award for the most natural display of animals and the educational strength that comes with that. The first wolf howl of the season is being conducted by a group of students from Ohio. They're from Hocking College,
2 nights in a row now, we've done our howls out here and we've heard wolves calling from over near Fox Lake. We've had pretty good success, and I'm just got my fingers crossed that when we howl tonight, they'll respond for us.
To understand the forest, you have to hear what it has to say.
Peter practices what he calls listening to the forest. Well, that's really a more technical way of saying manage the forest according to the biology and the silvicultural characteristics of the trees themselves.
Forestry in Ontario, and in particular in this region, is very good, but it's always going to have room to get better. And getting better is heavily based on the data that's available to us and the most current analysis of that data. We invest quite heavily ourselves in an in-house research program, some of which are in partnership with various universities like the University of Toronto, like the University of Freiburg, and some of which we just completely do on our own accord.
It's important to have science to underpin your understanding of the future, of what you do now to sustain the values into the future.
So we have all information related to the shrinking and swelling of this tree in 15 minutes time interval. Then we measure at the same time temperature and precipitation, and our data also help to contribute to this question, how to make a forest more adaptive to changes.
He has a vision or a view of that forest that works perfectly for training students in the area of conservation.
Students have an excellent opportunity for education. It's the hands-on that is our big focus down at our campus there. And when we come up here, we get that to the best level.
I hope that everything that we do at Haliburton Forest is very educated. We invest a lot in research so that we know the impact that we have. And I think that's the first step to being truly sustainable.
For us, the key priority is managing the forest as the forest tells us to do it.
Sometimes, to do research, you need to look down.
He had a submarine.
A submarine? Come on.
I don't know if he still has that submarine that he had under the lake.
So we really needed something to, literally a vehicle, to take people underwater to explain the lake ecology, because lakes and water cover about a third of Haliburton Forest.
Ah, the submarine story. Haliburton Forest had this great idea based on a pretty simple premise.
Learning is going to be fun. You can stand at the edge of a lake and talk about the lake until the cows come home, and not very much sticks, and also not very much is really interesting and intriguing. However, if you do it in a submarine and literally see the fish that you're talking about and the environment, the underwater environment that you're talking about from the seat of a submarine, that's a different matter.
And where he chose to launch the grand submarine experiment was a story unto itself. McDonald Lake, the deep, dark, and unique home to an ancient fish that had only recently come to light.
I found in my studies that we had a unique and very different stock of lake trout. The more we studied them, we realized they had this old ancestral history, and they were actually glacial relics.
Another feature that we discovered underwater was a stone pile. At some point of time, an archaeologist came diving with us, and when we passed that pile of rocks, he looked at that and he said, you know what, that's not just a pile of rocks. He said, well, if this structure is man-made, it will be held together with shims. If I see a shim, I will know that it has been put together by humans, because when they push on it and it wiggles a little bit, they will put this shim in, and that's a very human trait. Down he went, and when he came back up after 20 minutes, he was just showing the victory sign, and what I thought was the victory sign, but what he really meant was he found 3 shims. So what's the explanation? We need to find out now what's the story behind this. So we cast our net further, and we ran into some historians, scientists out in Nova Scotia. They looked at it and sure, they said, yes, this is exactly what we expected. This is human-made, and our explanation is that about 7,000 to 9,000 years ago, so prior to the pyramids of Egypt being built, early humans, early settlers were here, and they built this to leave a message.
News of the submarine? Word was getting out. First tourists, then scientists, and now the government.
There is no standard for private submarines or tour submarines in Canada. We looked far and wide. We made over 600 dives with paying customers. Overall, we did about 1,000 dives with the submarine without any major incidents. And suddenly, the governments knocked on our door. First knocks on the door we received from the federal government, Department of Transportation. Two gentlemen came down here with, as they later explained, the intent of shutting us down. They shook their head and said, "This is unbelievable. This thing is bomb-proof." And that's exactly the word they used. We wouldn't have expected anybody to be able to conceive something like this. That's what we expected, but with government, you never know. And that surprise then came when the provincial government knocked on our door. The Minister of Labour, and it's actually the construction branch of the Minister of Labour, is responsible for diving safety. The gentleman that came here looked at the submarine, and of course we told him, well, if you're not comfortable, if you don't know what you're looking at, if you don't understand how it works, why don't you talk to your federal counterparts? And right off the bat, he threw up his hands and we have nothing to do with the federal government, we do our own assessment. And he was really only concerned about the pilot. He was, the passengers are the affair of the federal government. He called on to the Ontario Provincial Police because they have divers. One day a whole cordon of police cars came driving down the road to the submarine. All the officers in the area obviously wanted to be in on that because they'd heard of it, but they'd never seen it. Police divers just stood in this in awe and said, "This is neat, but we are divers, this is a submarine, what do you want us to do?" Off they went, and Minister of Labour, he had a friend who was a Navy officer, called him over. And, at that time, Canada had 4 submarines. One of them had just burned out at sea, and the other 3 were in dry dock because of issues. So my entering comment to him was, well, I guess you want to come and see the only functioning submarine in Canada, which probably didn't go over very well. Both gentlemen didn't really have a lot of a sense of humor.
In the end, after more than a year of constantly meeting government demands, all it took was one bureaucrat to dry dock the sub for good.
An old fart, probably 2 years before retirement, who really doesn't give a damn, can floor this, and nobody, there is this, the way the system works, nobody is there to pick up the piece and say, well, let's reassess this.
Sometimes you need to look up, 40 feet up.
We started to become very active in the field of outdoor education, and I looked at what the staff were doing, the programs they were delivering, and they were delivering programs in a forest and not seeing the forest for the trees. So it really grew out of my professional frustration that we have all this captive audience in our forest, but we really didn't incorporate forestry and trees in what they were concerned with. And out of that grew the idea to literally add another dimension.
When you're traveling across the bridge connected by 2, always stay attached.
Instead of that walk through the forest that would be just boring as heck and people wouldn't listen, we just elevate that 20 meters into the canopy of a forest. And suddenly, not only did you have literally a captive audience, but suddenly people were seeing trees from a different perspective, started to ask questions. And of course, then you can talk about forest ecology, because we think that as humans, because we're earthbound, that everything happens on the ground, but really the activity in the forest happens up in the canopy, and suddenly you have that canopy fully exposed. And not only do you have a recreational activity, but you also have that opportunity to talk about things that otherwise they wouldn't feel would be of any interest.
The Canopy Tour not only opened the top of the forest world to the curiosity of weekend explorers, but also to scientists who were able to make unique discoveries of their own.
We found new species up there, and this has initiated some of the research that I was involved with originally on looking at tree canopies and biodiversity. Trees, everybody was looking in the Amazon, on the West Coast rainforest. What about here? Everybody goes to these exotic places. We haven't even looked at the canopies here. People are always surprised, but yes, even in Ontario, there's places, and we've never been in species we have yet to discover. So.
It takes a lot more than a wolf center and a canopy tour to keep this going.
I think Peter just gets up every morning and says, okay, what new business can I create today? Can I do it by dinner time? And when someone tells him that's crazy, I think it probably just motivates him to work harder to do it. I would say Haliburton Forest is definitely one of a kind.
Besides being a forester, I'm also a businessman. And if we're sitting 3 hours from Toronto out in the boonies, if you want to attract an audience, you don't attract an audience by doing something mediocre. You need to attract the audience by doing something that's outstanding, that really is something that you must see. For the urbanized public today to lose the feel for forests and for the outdoors, I think is very dangerous. We already see that a lot of urbanites have notions that almost run counter forests, although their heart is in it and they want to protect forest. Because they don't understand how forests function, they draw the wrong conclusions and make the wrong decisions, sometimes misguided by political notions that this is the way to protect the forest. But we believe at Haliburton Forest very strongly that the way we do it, by actually inviting people and by utilizing the forest, this is the best way to protect the forest and carry it into the future.
When he tries a new business enterprise, it fascinates him to get it going, to prove that it works. And once it's working and it goes into a routine, then he likes to hand it over to somebody to take over and to run the daily business with it. But initially, to get it going and to get his idea into practice, that's the challenge which he needs, and that's, I think, what drives him.
Haliburton Forest is the example of the real world. We don't have to take students there and teach them and show them and then say, and yes, this can work in the real world. He's showing students, not only is there a great vision, but you can make it work.
Half of our business is forestry, and I think that is still to a large extent the heart and soul of it. But half of the business is sharing the land with other people.
Peter also has the self-interest in sharing it with others, and that he wants people to come there and enjoy it and spend money and help the thing pay for itself. And I also suspect that Peter wants to share it to show people what it is he's trying to do, and in many cases, to show that he was right. Because he's been engaged in a lot of debate. A lot of people said he was nuts, you can't do that, you're not managing the forest properly, you'll never make a living out of this. So I think to a certain extent there's a sharing of it. It's kind of I told you so. Come and see how this turned out.
I say most of us inherently want to keep it for ourselves effectively. We want to go to remote areas. We want nobody to be there ideally. That's not Peter's model. Peter's model, he's happiest when there's 300 people in his forest.
Just when it's all coming together, the weather does what it wants. In this case, a tornado.
We had storms, tornadoes. For a forester, the forest is everything. And suddenly, within 5 minutes, you see that a third of your forest is lying on the ground. Those things are the moments where you think, let's just pack the bags and there is no future.
It was, I think, ½ kilometer wide in some area, and it killed every single tree. So they were all on the ground and they had to be harvested all at the same time.
Truckloads and truckloads of hemlock lying on log landings, which couldn't be sold to sawmills. And together with a friend, we looked at what could be done with all this hemlock that nobody wanted. Our initial idea was to sell small cabins up to 200, 300, perhaps even 400 square feet. Today, 20 years later, we're selling log homes all over North America, and their size probably ranges anywhere from 800 to about 3,000 and even 3,500 feet.
If you are a person of the land molds you, and that land has molded him. I don't think he came here to make hemlock log houses. He came here and the land gave him hemlock.
Haliburton Forest was raising the environmental bar to a whole new level.
I have had cottage neighbors here at Haliburton Forest who have come to me from time to time and tell me that they hear that we're doing such a great job, but then they go into Haliburton Forest and they see that our forest looks really, really messy. And why does our forest look so messy if, in fact, we're doing such a good job? And I have to explain to them that the messier a forest looks, the healthier it is.
Leaving all the tops and the fine branches on the ground, it provides two sort of ecological benefits. One is that's where most of the nutrients in each tree are stored. The bark and the wood itself contain relatively few nutrients for the future growth of the stand. So leaving them in the forest ensures that there's lots of nutrients for the trees to grow in the future. The other reason is it provides a bit of structure as well. The living tree by weight is about 7% living cells. A dead tree by weight, or a piece of dead wood on the ground, is like 25% living cells. And so deadwood is a critical ecological component of each stand for saproxylic insects, which consume dead wood, salamanders, fungi and bacteria, and many other things. And so leaving it in the forest is one of the things that we do to kind of achieve that ecological objective.
One of the ththings that we embraced very early is single tree selection harvesting, which means that you take individual trees out of the forest. Before that, you mark them, and only the marked trees can be removed from the forest. Obviously, that's a major paradigm shift for a logger or forestry worker who, for the previous years of his life, has just gone into the forest, looked at the forest, taken the tree that he likes to take, and doesn't have to pay any attention to the rest. So obviously there was a lot of resistance to this. Today there is some resistance, and some forest managers frown on these management regimes because obviously they're a little bit more expensive. However, they're the only ones that are sustainable and will carry us into the future.
This approach to managing a forest was uncommon and even unwelcome at first. But over the years, it's become the global standard. Forest certification is an internationally recognized practice now. Organizations like the Forest Stewardship Council, or the FSC, enforce strict ecological regulations. What used to be considered radical is now seen as the most ethical way to manage forests.
Haliburton Forest was the first forest in Canada in 1997 to be certified. We did break the ice. We were the first ones to be there. We paid our price for it, but we also can look back in, I would say, in glory that we were the first ones. We saw the light.
A lot of the industry people didn't think the FSC standard was going to fly. They saw it as very threatening. There were a few people that saw it as being technically wrong or had quibbles with it. So when Peter went in and became an early adapter, that brought some criticism from industry circles, and turns out he was ahead of his time, because now those guys, the industry guys, guess who's being the big adapter of FSC?
If we go to the store and we see that there's FSC certified product on the shelves, we have the confidence that this wood came to us in a sustainable way.
So if it has a band of blue paint, that means that it's a crop tree, high quality tree with a really good crown that is going to be fully released. So this tree being one of the small, nice trees with a good crown, everything has been cut around it. It is now fully released, and theoretically, the growth potential of the entire area is now available to this stem. All of the water, all of the nutrients, and all the light. There should be nothing stopping it from growing at an amazing rate.
Here is a real-time logger, the ones that you normally see on TV. Here he's sitting in front of you.
Bold gray beard. Been in here forever.
That's right.
What are some ways that you've seen logging change since you started?
Everything's going mechanical.
I believe it's the future, because there are no young loggers coming up. Logging is a very hard job, and logging is a very dangerous job. And that's also where society, like the Ministry of Labour, really is pushing for this, because they say we rather have no forestry operation than forestry operation where people get hurt and killed. I don't know if you saw, he cut a dead birch, and while he was cutting it, the top fell off. For a logger, that's literally deadly. So he doesn't even blink an eye. So that's really where socially, a lot of people say, and I believe so too, this is the future.
We do low-grade the forest, so the tree markers go for trees with major defects first. So basically trees that are not likely to be there next rotation anyways, which translates into generally much poorer log quality. That's what Mike at the mill is going to get. And he is the one who has to figure out how to market it and what to do with it.
You know, whatever the forest can produce on a sustainable basis should be the output going into the mill. In principle, that's the way that forestry should always be done.
Finally, enough of the forest had matured to open his sawmill. The dream come true.
When I arrived here in Canada, my dream was to double the size of Haliburton Forest to about 100,000 acres and to have a sawmill where we would be processing all the logs from those 100,000 acres. Wherever you go and you see a sawmill, the sawmiller goes to the forester and demands certain qualities and quantities of timber. At Haliburton Forest, it's the other way around. One of the surprises that I had as a forester going into the sawmilling business was the amount of what we referred to originally as waste. I saw residue, chips, sawdust, bark as huge mountains of problems. All the trees and all the wood that goes in doesn't translate into the same volume of lumber and timbers coming out. Actually, only half of what is going in wood fiber comes actually out as usable or commercial product. The other half is what used to be referred to as waste or residue in the form of bark, in the form of chips, and in the form of sawdust. That other half, which is obviously a very large volume, can also be utilized. Today, looking back after over 30 years, obviously the dream has come reality. And I believe right now we're over 200 products that are being produced from wood from Haliburton Forest and sold into the retail market. I always said that my time to retire will be when Haliburton Forest has its own sawmill and we're at 40,000 hectares in size.
How long ago would you have said that?
I said that when I arrived here.
And you're at 40,000?
We're at 40,000 hectares and we have a sawmill.
So do you have something to announce to us? On a personal level, where do you draw your inspiration?
From a beautiful day like this. Being out here on a day like this, in beautiful weather, surrounded by forests, clean air, I think this is a resource manager's dream. And yeah, this is where I can refuel, recharge my batteries and go back to the office desk and fight my battles.
Not that he's satisfied, he's still looking for ways to eliminate waste, again, ahead of bureaucracy.
Good morning. I'm Peter Schleifenbaum.
How you doing, Peter?
I'm the manager of Haliburton Forest. We are waiting to hopefully pass the electric inspection for our biochar reactor.
Are you concerned at all with this? Like where this should go?
It's really, when you deal with government, it's a crapshoot.
The process to get biochar is called pyrolysis. You take any cellulosic feedstock, you can take rice husks, coconuts, you can take wood, in our case, and put them into these pyrolyzers. And you burn them, but you burn them with very little oxygen. And you don't create any ash, you create charcoal.
The residual material produced from the trees during processing at the sawmill is turned into biochar, which then goes back to the forest to feed the trees. Biochar, which is 99.8% carbon, has the ability to amend soils and help the trees grow considerably faster. For Haliburton Forest, biochar can be that last vital link that eliminates all waste from the sawmill's production cycle.
You don't have to apply it every year. You apply it once every 5,000 years, 10,000 years. I mean, there isn't a better way to sequester the carbon. What we're really sitting on here in Haliburton, with all the forests that surround us, is a sustainable oil well.
This has taken a year. The first inspection here was last October, I believe. It took us this long to get to this point. So we've lost 9 months in the process. This was just for the electrical inspection. On the one hand, they have all this huge bureaucracy that is doing all these inspections. On the other hand, they have ministries or departments of economic development. I think those departments of economic development need to have a little bit more influence on all those inspectors and say, here, let's review your system. Let's see how this system works or doesn't work, and especially how it doesn't work for industry. Not giving away your standards, maintaining that same standard, but shedding some of that bureaucracy and some of that process, which really gets in the way and in the end defeats everybody's purpose. The issue for us is that a lot of the things that we're doing are very unique. There is no script, there is no, what we've done here, be it the Submarine or the Biochar or other developments, the Canopy tour, those are really unique. They don't exist. Some of those don't even exist anywhere else in Canada. Some of them, they're unique in the world. So now we have to subject ourselves to the laws of the land, and I have no issues with that, especially when it applies to safety. We want to have as safe an operation as possible. But when then laws are being applied which don't accomplish that at all, And again, the submarine is the best example where you apply diving rules to the operation of a submarine. Then I just have to raise my hand and says, well, the system is incompetent. The system really has broken down, has failed us completely, because there's a great thing. I mean, I got a commendation from Queen's Park, basically the same day that the inspector shut the submarine down, saying it is unsafe. They've got their rules and they're going to apply the rules. If the rules don't fit, that's not their problem, that's your problem.
Haliburton Forest passed the latest round of inspections, and it's making biochar, at least for now.
The only thing that I am a little bit afraid of, the whole development here is depending on one person. And as long as this person is strong and healthy, it goes on, but it's risky. There should be more like him.
As far as he's concerned, I think he's just a steward, and he just wants to be looked at as somebody who's done the best he could to take care of this piece of land, and good for him.
No forester plants a tree for themselves. It is always about the future, and so we all just sort of go, I know society will need that tree. I have no idea in 100 or 700 years what they'll need that tree for, but I just know they'll need it.
When you talk about sustainability, when you talk about stewardship, we are just links in a chain. And yes, we look at our lives and we look at how our parents have affected us, but I think we also need to look at how we affect our children and our grandchildren. And if we look at it at sustainability from that perspective, that chain with all those links, where we are one of those links, then we can be sustainable, we can create stewardship, and that applies to a forest, to a farm, to a house, to a garden. It really applies to everything, and we really need to adopt this long-term thinking from things that we buy to things that we acquire, that we get from our parents, that we give on to our children. That's really what I think is very important, that we need to pass on to the public at large and to future generations.
What it gives us is hope for the world. That if you can do it in a 40,000 hectare forest, you should be able to do it in other places as well.
The story of Haliburton Forest and Wildlife Reserve is about what's possible. It tells us we can do things smarter, that we don't have to harm the earth to make a living, and that preserving the health of the planet can actually keep people and our economy healthy too. It takes vision, maybe stubbornness, definitely guts. But in the end, it can be done. So what's stopping us?
You're welcome.
We have always had only one Earth. Our science may increase its bounty, and our husbandry may make its resources go further. But its capacity to support life cannot be indefinitely extended.